start of Final Fantasy XIV's brand new major story arc has arrived, and it's a divisive one. Having to follow some of the best storytelling in the entire franchise was always going to be tough, and unfortunately it misses the mark for pretty much the first half of the expansion. After putting in a good couple hundred hours at this point, I think Dawntrail is going to go down as one of the weaker expansions in terms of its main scenario, but from a gameplay perspective there's some positive steps being made in my opinion. I've been playing Dawntrail since literally a few minutes after early access started, and aside from the obvious queues to get in on the first day and a little bit of congestion when I've been on hunt trains, it's been a significantly smoother launch than Endwalker. That's not to say it didn't have any problems. Amon Savage was definitely a surprise for everyone doing the raid roulettes. But my experience with the launch was virtually flawless, and the last few weeks of playing through the main scenario and the majority of the side content has been great, apart from the state of the MSQ itself, which I'm sure you've heard mixed things about. So let's jump in and see where our next adventure takes us, what stumbles it makes along the way, and what it does well. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other videos on Final Fantasy XIV and all of the previous expansions, as well as future Final Fantasy content in the coming months. And without further ado, we're heading west to the New World. This is my review of Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. Let's talk about what I'll be covering in this video. This will be a review of all of Dawntrail's launch content. The new features, the 2 new jobs, the role quests, the first set of raids, and of course, the main scenario. The first part will be as spoiler free as I can possibly make it, and I'll be using footage from me running some roulettes as the 2 new jobs and a little bit of the first 2 of the new zones, so there won't be really anything in the way of visual spoilers in case you're worried about that. I'll give you plenty of warning when we do dive into spoiler territory, and of course there's timestamps to skip those parts if you want to. So let's talk about the most obvious change Dawntrail brings, and that's the graphics update. Character models and lighting got a pretty nice upgrade across the board, and in the right lighting the faces in particular look fantastic, with much better skin textures and proper reflections and glistening effects on the eyes, lips and a lot of gear. A lot of the older areas aren't all that different, but the things that stood out for me were the aetherites, the gold saucer and a lot of the foliage. Regarding most of the textures, the best way I can describe it is it's like turning the textures up from medium to high in most other games. They're higher resolution than before, but it's not a huge change. They are trying to preserve the art style after all. A lot of gear is still very pixelated unfortunately, and there's some frankly awful shadows in some places, but it's an improvement overall, albeit not the major improvement that some people might have been hoping for. I'm not someone who puts a lot of stock in graphical fidelity, and personally I think 14's art direction was already pretty solid. That said, the new zones all look fantastic and I'm looking forward to when some of the older regions and gear sets get updated. For the fashion conscious among us, there's 2 dye channels for certain pieces of gear, as well as a new faceware slot for glasses and monocles and the like. For me this doesn't make a huge difference. The 2 dye channels isn't the massive game changer a lot of people thought it was, unfortunately, and there's not many pieces of gear that do actually have the 2 dye slots. The secondary dye slots are also very inconsistent. Sometimes it'll be a belt or some buttons rather than something more obvious. Fingers crossed the devs go back and add the extra dye channel to older gear in the future. Most of the changes are just quality of life stuff, which is always welcome. The new blacklisting features are great to combat the handful of problematic players you might run into, as well as those RMT bots, and the feature that changes the actions on your hotbar to their follow-ups is great for those of us who want less clutter. I do wish that you could change the melee jobs as 1-2-3 combos into a single slot though, especially given that Pictomancer has 4 3-spell combos that each use a single slot. Speaking of which, let's talk about the 2 new jobs Dawntrail brings to the table, Viper and Pictomancer. They're both relatively simple and quite a lot of fun to play. I've got the most experience with Pictomancer at the moment as I used it to go through the main scenario, so we'll start there. Pictomancy is the art, no pun intended, of bringing paintings to life to assault your enemies, first introduced to the series in Final Fantasy VI via the sassy but kind-hearted Realm. And while she doesn't make an appearance in Dawntrail, what with 14's version of her character existing well over 1,500 years ago, the Moogle who introduces us to Pictomancy doesn't miss the opportunity to make a pun based on her name. Pictomancer's kit is pretty simple. You've got 2 flavours of single target and AoE combos, with the basic ones building up a gauge which you can spend on the skill Subtractive Palette, which allows you to use the second set of combos. The good thing about these is you can mix and match without breaking the combo like most other jobs. For example, you could cast a single target spell followed up by an AoE, then a single target to finish the combo. This extends to when you use Subtractive Palette as well, but once it's active you have to use all 3 stacks in order to go back to your 2 basic combos. Upon landing the final step of any of these combos, the water or thunder spells, you're given one of up to 5 splashes of white paint, which can be used for the instant cast Holy, or can be turned into black paint via the use of Subtractive Palette to cast Comet, which, much like the spell combos, has to be used before you can go back to using the white paint for Holy. The basics are very simple and it's pretty much impossible to mess up. The canvas is where things start to get interesting. There are a set of longer casts to store a set of instant cast spells. The first is the creature motif, which cycles through 4 different single-use AoEs which are added to the canvas. The second and fourth grant access to more powerful straight-line AoEs upon execution, making for some potent bursts quite frequently. The second is the weapon motif, and this one's much more simple. It grants access to a skill which gives you 3 stacks of hammer time, allowing to use an incredibly powerful AoE attack which always crits. Finally, there's the landscape motif, which puts down a circular zone which increases your damage while inside it, while giving a buff to all of your party members. It also decreases your casting and cooldown times, makes another of your spells an instant cast, grants you access to another AoE spell that also heals nearby allies, takes you out to dinner, and gives you a nice back rub to boot. Okay, I'm kidding about those last 2, but this thing is incredibly strong. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The devs made the strange decision to make the basic AoE combo very weak. Unless it hits a minimum of 4 enemies, it's a DPS loss compared to the single target combo. This doesn't apply to the subtractive palette combos, but it's still a little awkward when your tank pulls 3 mobs and you're just sat there like a duty support NPC targeting one at a time. Other than that minor gripe, there's some nice utility in the Pictomancer's kit as well. There's a barrier which at higher levels can be spread to your party, as well as a dash which gives you a 5-second sprint afterwards for some useful mobility. Overall, I think Pictomancer's my new favourite caster. It's simple yet powerful. The only big complaint I have would be the sound effects it makes. They're annoying and a bit too loud compared to everything else. I know that sounds petty, but if you're going through an alliance raid or you're a PvP fan and there's a handful of Pictomancers involved, all you'll hear are those weird wobbly paint sounds while you're trying to listen out for the actually important audio cues. Tone that down and adjust the AoE damage and I think Pictomancer will probably be my go-to DPS job. Oh, and the PvP limit break is Fat Chocobo, which is amazing. The other new job, and Dawntrail's featured job, is Viper. Final Fantasy XIV's first wholly original job dual-wields swords which can be connected together to make a twin blade. It's another simple yet fun job where you do one of 2 single target or AoE attacks which chain into one of 2 different attacks, which chain into another of 2 different attacks, then you finish a combo with an off-GCD attack. It sounds way more complex than it is, but thanks to the buttons changing, it's virtually impossible to mess up any of these combos. Outside of those basic combos, there's a pair of other combos on cooldowns, a ranged AoE that you can build up stacks for, a dash for moving to an enemy or a party member, and that's about it really. The higher level abilities add more attacks to the mix via a gauge that can be built up and spent on an ability reminiscent of Final Fantasy IX's Trance, only not going off at the end of a battle and being completely wasted. If you know, you know. But even then, it's really simple, and because the hotbar icon changes after each attack, you literally just have to sit there and spam 1 or 2 buttons almost the entire time. The only thing you have to worry about is the standard melee DPS positionals, but even then it's simple. The icon's colour changes to correspond where to stand, red for rear, green for flank? Now I don't enjoy melee DPS as much as the other roles, but Viper looks like one I'll probably keep levelled for future expansions role quests at the very least. As I said, it's simple to play and good for those days where you want to just relax and press a few buttons to get through your roulettes or something. The job quests for these 2 are more of what you've come to expect from new jobs being introduced. There's a tutorial for each, both of which do a great job explaining things, then there's a short questline ending in a boss fight to make sure you understand how everything works. I did quite like the Pictomancer questline where you have to search for this Moogle's missing companion, even if it was a little predictable. The Viper quests left a little to be desired, honestly. Their lore isn't really fleshed out, and there's something about Vipers empowering themselves with the strength of their ancestors, but it's never explained in game, despite Yoshi P telling us it would. I guess it's another of those take what he says with a grain of salt things. I assume it's the trance-like ability called Reawaken that I touched on a minute ago, but again it's not explained lore-wise in game. So that's the 2 new jobs. They're both great fun and very beginner friendly. I will say that they both feel pretty awful if your roulettes drag you into the lower level content, but I don't mind having some easier jobs to play. Of course, all of the other jobs got new abilities, but I haven't had all that much time to play around with them. A few quick thoughts on what I have played. Scholar gets a handy new damage over time ability and a great 20-second burst healing ability which has saved no end of dungeon runs for me already. Dancer gets a couple of extra AoEs that I now can't live without. I love the new White Mage dash they added, and I hate that they got rid of the Dark Knight's plunge for a terrible new dash. Really not a fan of that one. Alright, let's take a break from the gameplay and talk about the biggest part of every new expansion, the story. Now I'll be splitting this into 2 sections, one for each half of the main scenario, with a quick look at the mid-game side content in between. This is your first spoiler warning. Go to the time marked on screen or check out the timestamps below if you want to avoid story spoilers, and skip ahead to hear my overall verdict on the expansion in case you're someone who's on the fence about jumping back into 14 for Dawntrail. So this is the start of a brand new 10-year arc for Final Fantasy XIV. Coming off of the excellent Shadowbringers and Endwalker, Dawntrail had a lot to live up to, and to be completely honest, I really wasn't a fan of the first half of its main scenario. I'm fine with the need to do a lot of world building and set up for the future, and believe me, the payoff is damn good, but there is an obscene amount of fat that needed to be trimmed here, with some scenes dragging on for far too long while adding very little to the story. A lot of your enjoyment of Dawntrail will also depend on how much you like Wukla Mart as a character, as this is very much her story. We're just along for the ride. Our story picks up right after the handful of quests following our journey to the 13th, where Wukla Mart, claimant to the throne of Dawnservant in Tyrol, has travelled across the sea to Sharlayan in search of the Warrior of Light's assistance in a contest to determine Tuliola's next ruler, the right of succession. Wukla Mart is initially presented as this boisterous, overconfident warrior who loves to hunt big monsters to eat. As we saw during the pre-Dawntrail quests, she's actually a lot more naive and gives off the impression that she bit off a little more than she could chew while we were taking down a giant colibri on the Isle of Harm. I found her quite endearing to begin with, and it's just as well, because we're going to be spending a lot of time with her. She takes centre stage for the majority of the runtime, has the most dialogue, speak to Wukla Mart is the single most common quest objective, you get the idea. Now I just want to make it clear that Wukla Mart being the main focus isn't a problem for me, like it is for a lot of other players. Focusing the story on another character while your own ends up being a side character who's basically just along for the ride is nothing new to the Final Fantasy franchise. In fact, one of my favourite entries, Final Fantasy X, handles this wonderfully, and the whole rite of succession brings me back to Yuna's pilgrimage from that game. Let's back up a bit. Our party, consisting of the Warrior of Light, the twins Alphino and Alice, Krile, Erenville and Wukla Mart, set sail from Sharlayan across the seas to the western continent of Tyrol. And one thing that I'm grateful for is that we never have to go back to the older regions during the main scenario. I'm sure the patch quests will take us back there, but the base expansion's main scenario takes place entirely in Tyrol after the opening quest. It really does feel like a true fresh start, as we've left the entire rest of the world and all of our friends and allies behind to embark on a brand new adventure. The journey isn't smooth sailing, as we're caught up in a storm along the way. I kind of expected to see us having to rush around the ship to save people or maybe get attacked by sea creatures, but no, it's all a cutscene. It's well presented, with Erenville making for a great narrator throughout the story, and there's some great freeze frame shots for dramatic effect. I can't help but be a little disappointed at the lack of a bombastic opening set piece or something though. Would have been nice to have a bit more action, and that unfortunately is going to be a running theme throughout.
Enjoying yourself for a change?
At last, we are come to the land you call the New World. To my home, Tyrol.
We arrive in the Mesoamerican-inspired city of Tuliolal, Wukla Mart's home and our main hub for Dawntrail. It's absolutely beautiful, really showing off the upgraded graphics, and naturally has some fantastic music. It's this catchy jazz theme and is easily one of my favourite tracks from this expansion. I love the saxophone solo a few minutes in as well, and the night theme is even better. I've always been a big fan of 14's music, and Dawntrail continues the tradition of having excellent music throughout. But for the first time, it's got a handful of tracks that I'm not really all that into. Obviously not everything's going to be to my taste, so I'm not going to hold it against the game at all. So we're given the tour and it's off to meet with the Dawnservant himself, a two-headed Mamulja by the name of Gulul Jar Jar, and to learn more about the rite of succession. We arrive to see Estinian taking the trailer moment and sparring with the Dawnservant. He just so happened to be exploring the world and he pops up from time to time. As for the rest of the scions, we'll get to them in a bit.
That will do, Spearman. I will receive my darling daughter.
Gulul Jar Jar is a strong leader who managed to unite the continent of Tyrol's warring factions, and now serves as its ruler. The uncovered head, known as the Head of Resolve, is a loving father and fearsome warrior, while the head behind the veil is the Head of Reason, and is gifted in the arcane arts. Apparently it's been sleeping a lot recently due to his age, and that brings us to why we're here, the rite of succession. 4 claimants are tasked with travelling the continent, retracing the path Gulul Jar Jar took to unite the people, and to perform 7 feats for the various peoples of Tural in order to receive keystones, which slot into these stone tablets they're all given. Once a claimant obtains the full set, their final task is to use them to unlock the gate to the fabled City of Gold, if they can find it. The claimants are Zoralja, the First Promise and the trueborn son of Gulul Jar Jar, a stoic but powerful man hiding a dark ambition. He's a rare breed, as the so-called blessed siblings, the two-headed Mamulja, allegedly can't have children, and as an example of life's unyielding resilience, has garnered himself the title of Resilient Son. Kona, the Second Promise, an adopted son of Gulul Jar Jar. Kona shares a close bond with his sister, and upon crossing the seas to study in Sharlayan, gained the ambition to see his nation thrive through the technology he brought back with him, such as dirigibles and the railway. He's initially a very no-nonsense sort, who's set in his ways of technological advancement, but eventually we get to see him let his guard down as he slowly warms to the idea of doing things Wook Lamart's way. Speaking of whom, Wook Lamart, the Third Promise, and adopted daughter of Gulul Jar Jar. We already know plenty about her, but her goal as Dawn Servant would be to follow in her father's footsteps, keeping Tural as a peaceful nation and doing everything she can to make her people happy. Finally, Bakul Jar Jar, another two-headed Mamulja from the settlement of Mamuk, an arrogant bully who won a tournament to earn his spot in the Right of Succession. His people believe in the tradition of these two-headed blessed siblings being the only ones fit to rule. The claimants are all pretty stereotypical characters, to be honest, and the plot ends up being largely predictable from here on out. I don't have a problem with that, by the way, but what I do take issue with is how little there is for us to actually do in this story so far. The opening 3 or 4 hours are nothing more than talking to people and watching cutscenes. There's some great world building here as usual, but some of these scenes drag on for far too long, and a lot of the dialogue repeats things we've only recently been told. Then there's the jokes. Look, I'm normally a fan of 14's particular brand of humour, but Dawntrails fell flat for me. There's at least half a dozen jokes about Wook Lamart's seasickness, there's some scenes with those silly sound effects and accompanying funny music that just aren't funny to me, and then there's Wook Evu. You meet this guy in Kozamauka, one of the 2 zones the story splits off into, and his whole shtick is, "Oh no, I've insulted you, please take up your weapon and kill me," followed by whoever he's talking to, usually Wook Lamart, telling him to calm down and not worry about it, leading him to instantly snap out of it and say he won't worry about it.
Please, take up your axe and claim my impudent head!
I will not. Keep your head. I hate formalities anyway, so forget about it, alright?
Alright then, consider it forgotten.
The first time it did get a little smirk out of me, but the second time had me raising an eyebrow. By the 5th or 6th time they did this, I was sick of the guy. The gag itself is a common anime trope, but repeating it so frequently, and it is always the exact same bit every time he shows up, gets old incredibly quickly. I'm sure some people out there loved it, but repetitive humour just doesn't do it for me, and it made Wook Evu into one of the most insufferable characters in all of Final Fantasy for me. So the different feats then. As I mentioned, the story splits into 2 zones as per usual. There's Urkapacha and the aforementioned Kozamauka. In Urkapacha we meet with the Pelu Pelu, a clan of masked merchants originally from Final Fantasy X. The feat here is to tame a wild alpaca, but first we have to trade with the locals for a saddle infused with a calming scent. This is mercilessly dragged out, but once we've traded back and forth a bit, we get something worth trading for the saddle, and Wook Lamart's off to catch herself an alpaca. But not before Zoralja shows up to show how much better he is by catching a rare golden alpaca, without the need for one of these saddles no less. It's a great display of his strength and shows how hopeless things are for Wook Lamart. Thankfully she manages to catch one of her own after a little while. We don't get to help, and this is sort of a running theme for Dawntrail. A lot of the interesting events happen off screen or during a cutscene. I want you to remember back to Heavensward for a moment. The story split there had us going on a pair of large-scale solo duties. Dawntrail has none of this. In fact, it's not until the first dungeon where we actually get to do anything beyond killing a handful of enemies a few times. And you might think I was cherry-picking with the Heavensward example, but in roughly the same amount of time spent up until now, Stormblood had 2 solo duties and sent us off to its first dungeon. Even Shadowbringers, which had to do a lot of setup and world building, didn't drag things out for this long. Now, I'm not asking for constant action, but by this point there's been about 3 hours of cutscenes, and it turns out I'm not crazy for thinking this is a lot. Other people have done the research so I don't have to, and it just so happens that, in terms of cutscene duration, Dawntrail is the second longest expansion, with only Endwalker, which had to wrap up a decade's worth of storylines, being longer. And the gap between Endwalker and Dawntrail is nowhere near as big as the gap between Dawntrail and the third longest expansion, Shadowbringers. So much of this story is dragged out, there's so much tell over show, and there's comparatively fewer voiced cutscenes. All of this makes me feel like the main scenario was rushed. Not rushed as in it rushes through its story, of course, but rushed as in the writers and developers didn't take the time to trim the fat. This story could have been told with a lot less words and a lot less repetitive dialogue. The pacing is atrocious, and I genuinely wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this story content was cut down in the not too distant future. I understand the need for world building and setup, and believe me, all of this sluggish pacing does pay off eventually, but there's such a thing as too much. If not for me wanting to make this video, I would have mentally checked out shortly after the first dungeon, I think. I hate to complain and sound so negative about things, because honestly it does get so much better later, but the first half is by far the weakest expansion content we've had. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go over the rest of the feats. Up next is Kozamauka, where we help the local Hanu Hanu, not to be confused with the Vanu Vanu, revive their crops. This is where we run into the one-joke Wook Evu, who helps us to restore a float which has magical properties and is used in a festival to strengthen the reeds which the Hanu Hanu live off of. It's not very involved, but we're treated to an endearing scene of Wook Lamut riding the float, and that's her second keystone in the bag. Bakul Jar Jar shows up to try and steal the keystones, which honestly isn't all that surprising, and manages to fend off Wook Lamut's attacks, showing his strength and further enforcing the plucky underdog vibe that Wook Lamut's got going on. And to make her look even less capable, Kona shows up with some sort of concoction which instantly revives his section of the crops with just one drop. So it's back to Tuliolol, where we briefly help a goldsmith who travelled to Tural with us to get himself a job, before we make our way to the higher part of Kozamauka via a river, which serves as our first dungeon. This is where Kona's backup arrives in the form of Thancred and Urianger. Looks like we've got a friendly little competition on our hands, doesn't it? Well, unfortunately this is one of those things that was overhyped during the FanFest reveal. We were promised a story that would divide the Scions, but the reality is Thancred slows us down during the first dungeon, then we spend a little while actually working alongside Kona's group, before the whole idea of an actual rivalry happening completely falls apart and we're all working together again. I can't help but be disappointed that we didn't actually get any infighting between the Scions. The whole setup feels like one big missed opportunity to me. I think it would have been great to have to take on Thancred and Urianger as a dungeon boss, or even a solo instance, but I'm guessing the writers didn't want to piss fans of those two off or something. But anyway, I think that's enough negativity for now. Let's talk about the dungeons. This is where Dawntrail shines in my opinion. Its dungeon design is nothing spectacular and still follows the same formula we're used to, but the boss design is much improved. In fact, the encounter design across the board is fantastic. There is a pattern to a lot of the dungeon bosses, namely opening with a party-wide AoE then alternating between a couple of mechanics before combining them, but the difficulty has ramped up and it's surprisingly challenging. I've seen a fair few complaints about the difficulty, but honestly I think it's great. We're 5 full RPGs worth of story and gameplay in at this point, and even if you're only going through the main scenario, you've already had to deal with some fairly tough encounters before. An increase in difficulty should come as no surprise, and to be honest I really enjoy dungeon runs where there's actually a chance the party wipes. It's far more interesting to me than just going through the motions with no real threat. And the trials and raids are just as excellent, but we'll get to that in a bit. So we make our way through the first dungeon, Ihuikatumu, sorry if I butchered that, these names are hard to pronounce, with Bakul Jar Jar sabotaging our boat and Thancred blocking our path through a cave along the way, and we make it back to dry land in the upper region of Kozamauka. There's some nice scenes showing Wook Lamut and Kona's motivations for winning, and it's off to Earthenshire to meet with the Moblins for our third keystone. I'm genuinely surprised Nintendo didn't try to sue Square Enix for the name there, but these Moblins are essentially reskinned goblins, much like the Hanu Hanu were reskinned Vanu Vanu. Call it lazy, but it makes sense to have different versions of the beast tribes, or allied societies as the game now calls them, in different regions of the world. So these guys want us to bring a new artisan to join and work for them, so it's back to the goldsmith we helped earlier to get him another new job. He's initially skeptical about it, but accepts because it'll help the people who were so kind to him before. While we're in the city, we're challenged to a duel by Golul Jar Jar. It's a great encounter with a nice variety of mechanics, and it's set to the main theme of Dawntrail, another excellent and catchy tune. It's a shame it took so long for the expansion's first big solo battle, but what few there are all really well done, even if they don't come close to the scale of that big one from post Shadowbringers against all the Lunar Primals, which still remains my favourite of these. After the duel we have a quick chat with the Dawn Servant about Wook Lamut not being ready to rule, even further reinforcing the whole underdog thing, and it's back to Earthenshire. Meanwhile, Bakul Jar Jar confronts Zoralja, who absolutely humbles the so-called blessed siblings with a single blow to the gut. Zoralja's right-hand man, Sorelja, wants Bakul Jar Jar to be kept alive as he sees a use for him in the future. This leads to one of Dawntrail's more obnoxious segments, as Wooklamart gets herself captured and is up to us to rescue her. I didn't like the stealth sections in Endwalker, and they make a return here. It's clearer where the detection zone is now, but that doesn't stop these quests from being terrible. I'm sure there's some people out there who like these, but they're not for me. And if not for this sequence offering some character development to Kona, who genuinely becomes quite likeable now he's let his guard down to show how much he cares for his sister, I'd call it a completely pointless diversion. We track down her captors, and it's none other than Bakul Jar Jar and his cronies. As I said earlier, a lot of encounters like this just play out in cutscenes. It would have been nice to actually get to do something in a situation like this, and it's not the last time Dawntrail lets us down like this. Regardless, Bakul Jar Jar gets away, having stolen one of Wooklamart's keystones, so we'll have to take him on later to get it back. So it's back to the upper region of Okapacha to meet with the giants known as the Yokhui, as we take on our next pair of feats. First, we see the legendary beast Valagarmander encased in ice, who is watched over by the giants. As an FF6 fan, this was great to see. Valagarmander is the frozen Esper you interact with right at the start of that game, and seeing what is essentially the same thing with a more modern, fully 3D look gave me such a great nostalgia hit. After a quick run-in with a hostile group of Yokhui, and saving one of them from a giant bird's attacks, earning their respect, it's off to our next dungeon, the Mountain of Warkozormor. This one continues the excellent encounter design, with some great visuals to boot. Zoraal slows us down about halfway through, and breaking through the clouds on our way to the summit is a beautiful sight. I like the second boss in particular here, the aforementioned giant bird, whose attacks leave very small safe zones. The end boss is Gerfola, one of the larger Yokhui, who gives Wooklamart a fourth keystone and teaches us of Galul Jar Jar and his allies' efforts to seal Valagarmander away. And as if right on schedule, we get a call from Alphino letting us know that the beast has broken free from its icy prison. Turns out Bakul Jar Jar was responsible, and it's up to us to chase Valagarmander down for our first trial. Honestly, I didn't like this one too much to begin with. I did get it a couple of times on my trial roulettes though, and I quickly changed my mind on it. At time of recording, I'm yet to do either of Dawntrail's extreme trials, I'm waiting on some friends for that, but the normal version is excellent. When I first saw the big red text boxes to warn us about attacks during one of the FF14 live streams, I was a bit concerned that it'd feel a little too handholdy, but in reality it's just a different form of telegraph for attacks. These have popped up in dungeons a couple of times as well, and it's a nice way of mixing things up, I think. Unfortunately, I've had a few runs of a certain endgame dungeon where some of the random players I've been with don't understand how to read these text boxes and play at the same time, causing no end of messing up mechanics, but that's a player problem, not a game problem. As for Valagarmander, it's a great trial with some fun mechanics, including a handful that completely change the arena and introduce whole different sets of mechanics unique to those arenas, such as having to stand on areas that make you float to avoid lightning attacks, or dodging an avalanche. Another thing worth noting is both this and the second of Dawntrail's trials can be done using duty support, so the only time you ever have to queue to play with other people is for the final trial at the end of the expansion. There's been a lot of talk from Yoshi P and the 14 devs over the years about the idea of a fully single player version of the game, and maybe I'm reaching a bit here, but I think this might be a sign that something like that could be on the way, or at least being prepared for in the event the 14 ever goes offline. Of course, if Final Fantasy XI can still be going strong after over 20 years, there's no reason 14 can't, but still. So with the legendary beast dead for good, Wooklamart is handed her 5th keystone, as the original second feat was to reinforce Valagarmander's prison, and now there's no need for that, so it's back to Tuliolol once more. This is more for a quick break than anything else. We get yet another reminder of Wooklamart's motivations, wanting to see her people happy, as she recalls what are to her the best parts of our journey so far, including an old lady we just spoke to, who was wearing purple, but in this flashback is in red. 0 out of 10, literally unplayable. Jokes aside, we're off to our third zone, Yak Tel, for our next and final 2 keystones. This is the first zone that starts to look a little less conventional. The azure forest in the region's lower levels was battered by meteors in ancient times, giving the land its distinct colours. It's in this lower region where things start to finally get interesting, but first we're in the upper region to take part in a cooking contest to represent the coming together of the Mamuljar and the Hrothgar of Tural. This is where we team up with Kona as I mentioned before, while Zoraal and Bakul Jar Jar are forced to work together against us. After hunting down the recipe and learning about how the people were united, we managed to put our culinary skills to use and perfectly replicate the meal. 6 keystones down, 1 to go. Before we leave, we speak with the leader of this settlement, a Hrothgar named Shunmu Ruk. It turns out that he is, in fact, Wooklamart's biological father, and this is another thing I sort of take issue with. It's largely brushed off and doesn't impact Wooklamart in the slightest. Her father doesn't seem to care all that much, and neither does she. It begs the question of why it was even brought up in the first place. I think I'd rather have not known who her birth parents were at all, considering they really didn't do anything with it. At any rate, we get to take on Bakul Jar Jar as Wook Lamart next, to reclaim the keystone he stole earlier.
I'm not losing to the likes of you. I'm going to become Dawn's servant, and I will protect my people!
It's one of the better solo battles with plenty of varied mechanics, including having to use limit breaks several times throughout in order to keep Wook Lamart's health up. This is yet another example of Dawntrail's excellent encounter design, and things really start to improve from here on out. It's off to the lower region and the settlement of Mamook next. This is Bakul Jar Jar's home turf, and its people want nothing to do with us. We quickly run into Zoroark, who has been defeated by the shade of his father. This is the final feat, to defeat Gulul Jar Jar as he was in his prime. Unfortunately for Zoroark, he let his frustration get the better of him and tried to harm the Elector, the person in charge of the feat, thus getting himself disqualified from the right of succession. So with Bakul Jar Jar licking his wounds and Zoroark disqualified, Wook Lamart's only competition is Kona, who after seeing Wook Lamart's resolve, decides to forfeit, leaving Wook Lamart to finish the rite and claim the throne for herself. Honestly, this whole thing was quite predictable. Either way, Bakul Jar Jar tries to atone for his sins and help Wook Lamart in communicating with his people, as our party tries to help them with their farming issues down here. See, the meteorites which battered the land permanently changed it so certain crops can't grow. The people of Mamook had relied on the Blessed Siblings to try and claim the throne so that they can have new lands to live more comfortably in. But the Blessed Siblings bring terrible suffering of their own. Conceived from the union of two different species of Mamuljar, the Hubigo and the Bunawar, the Blessed Siblings are incredibly powerful creatures. However, most of the children die, with only 1 in 100 surviving. The people of Mamook had grown so desperate and so reliant on these Blessed Siblings that they've had to endure countless losses over the years just so they can try and make better lives for themselves. So after our party figures out which crops to grow where so that Mamook can thrive without the need for new lands, it's time for Wook Lamart to take on her father's shade and win her final keystone. This is a trial in all but name, as our party, joined by Konas, take on the shade in a single player battle. I feel like a broken record at this point, but it's yet another great encounter, reusing the mechanics from our previous fight with the Dawn Servant and adding a few more to the mix to account for the second head being active. One of the biggest goals for Dawntrail was to improve the gameplay experience, and it definitely shows. With the Dawn Servant's shade defeated, Wook Lamart gains her final keystone, and all that's left is to find the Golden City. The legendary Eorzean sailor and friend of the Dawn Servant, Ketenram, makes an appearance here. He's mentioned a handful of times in dialogue as the person who sought to prove that the new world existed to Eorzeans, and is basically here to make sure that the Elector, Zereljar, not to be confused with Sareljar, does his job despite his obvious bias towards Bakul Jar Jar. Honestly, these Mamuljar names are really getting hard to keep track of. So with a little help from the locals, we track down the Golden City at the Skydeep Cenote, the ruins where all of the deceased Blessed Siblings were interred. This is dungeon number 3, and is essentially just some plain old ruins, but the end is full of glowing stone structures, giving it this otherworldly vibe. Another great set of bosses here, with the last one making it very easy to accidentally fall off the rather small platform. I mean, for other people, not me. I totally didn't get knocked off it the first time, I don't know what you're talking about. After the dungeon, we arrive at the gate to the Golden City, and Wook Lamart is declared the winner of the Rite of Succession.
Is this it? The Golden City?
You, my dear daughter, have found the entrance to the City of Gold and triumphed in the Rite of Succession.
We can't go in yet for some unknown reason, so it's back to Tuliolol for Wook Lamart to officially be declared the new Dawn Servant.
Because if there's one thing my journey has taught me, it's that your happiness is my happiness!
The pop music here isn't my jam at all, but as I said earlier, the music can't all cater to my taste. And in a move that shouldn't surprise anyone, Wook Lamart offers Kona a seat alongside her for them to both rule over Tuliolol as joint Dawn Servants. We also learn that Gulul Jar Jar's head of reason died 3 years ago, and wasn't really sleeping behind that veil at all. It was he who came up with the Rite of Succession, but he died before it could all be set up. Him being dead doesn't really add much to the story, and it was another sort of predictable plot point, but it is what it is. Meanwhile, back in Mamook, Ketenram is ambushed and knocked out. A short while later we learn that he had a set of keystones, and Zoraal had them stolen so that he could reach the Golden City. Arriving at the entrance and having stolen the key to get inside from the Dawn Servant's vault, a voice calls out to him, offering the power to remake worlds. Zoraal then disposes of Soralja, and asks the person beyond the gate to deliver him a world that bends to his will. And that's roughly the halfway point of Dawntrail. I hope I didn't drive too many of you away with all the complaints, but I think they're justified. The pacing was atrocious throughout, and it's only in the last couple of hours that things slowly started to pick up. There's just one more rather slow-paced section to go before the story really gets interesting, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Now seems like a good time to talk about the side content that Dawntrail has to offer. It should come as no surprise that the side content in Dawntrail is largely similar to the last couple of expansions. You've got the sightseeing log, which involves another tower jumping puzzle that you have to get to one of the vistas for, though it's nowhere near as fun as the one in Kugane. There's also the usual hunt marks, which I've spent a lot of time on already. To keep with the theme of great encounter design, it's been a lot of fun learning the mechanics of some of these. One in particular telegraphs its various AoEs through a speech bubble, which had me feeling pretty smart once I'd worked it out and helped a few others with it. Of course, you only ever see the mechanics go off when there's not all that many people around, and the hunt trains in particular have been very busy, seeing as each zone is split into at least 3 instances, with some having 6 for the first couple of weeks. Hunt trains have been great, albeit a little frustrating with the congestion when swapping between instances. There's also the usual batch of side quests, including a chain that gets you access to a corn minion that people are obsessed with. There's the now standard deliveries questline for gatherers and crafters with the not so subtle name of What You Makey Makey, where we have to help various people running market stalls to revive their businesses, and last but not least are the role quests. These might very well be the worst role quests so far. Whereas Shadowbringers had them tie into the story, where you hunt down the various corrupted members of Ardbert's old crew to grant them peace, and Endwalker had you travelling the realm to hunt down the blasphemies that arrived during the final days, Dawntrail's role quests have nothing to do with the main scenario. They're all about this group of Saturday morning cartoon villains called the Passage of the Unbound. I don't mind the lower stakes in both the main scenario and the role quests, but the role quests themselves just aren't very good, to be honest. Each of the members of this group have stolen some sort of relic, and it's up to us, alongside one of the various quest givers, to track them down and retrieve it. I won't go over everything in detail yet, mostly because I'm still not done with the melee DPS one, but they're mostly humorous little quest lines culminating in a boss fight. The problem I have with these is they're the exact opposite of challenging. In fact, the healer one in particular is insulting. It's a long-winded tutorial for Esuna, a spell all healers get at level 10. Dawntrail goes from level 90 to 100. Any healer who's got this far should know how Esuna works, but here we are learning about it like we've just started the game. It's jarring going from the more challenging encounters of the main scenario to having your hand held for the role quests. It doesn't need to be like this at all, and I'd honestly rather role quests be done away with entirely if they're not going to try and challenge players to show they can actually use their job's abilities effectively. And I'm sorry to be so negative again, but this is the one part of the side content I actively disliked. The rest was fine at worst and great at best. The pair of endgame dungeons and the first set of normal raids are some of 14's best, but we'll get to that in a bit. As for the rest of the role quests, they're fine. The end of the healer questline genuinely had me laugh out loud as the bad guy goes blasting off Team Rocket style, and the ranged magical DPS quests with the falling rocks were pretty silly too. On a whole, they're definitely the weakest role quests, but some of the humour is surprisingly good. It's worth noting that the master role quests, the short questline unlocked by completing all of the other role quests, won't be available until patch 7.1, as with Endwalker. There's also the usual leave quests and gather and crafter scripts to obtain, including a mount for gatherers to grind for, as well as the shared fate system, which has had a bit of an overhaul, making it easier to get the gemstones and splitting the ranks into 4 for each zone as opposed to 3. There's also a pair of extreme trials that I haven't got round to yet, and at time of recording the Savage tier isn't out yet, nor is the new treasure dungeon. But again, it's more of what we've come to expect, with nothing actually new coming along until at least 7.1. There is a ton of new content planned however. This won't be an Endwalker situation where the patch content was rather lacking. I can't wait for the new field operation and an actual relic grind this time. So that's a rundown of the mid-game side content. Overall it's pretty standard stuff. We'll talk about the 2 optional dungeons and the raids at the end of the main scenario. Speaking of which, this is your second spoiler warning. Major story spoilers from here on out, so skip ahead to the end to hear my overall thoughts on the expansion if you haven't finished the story yet. The timestamp is on screen and down below. With the Rite of Succession over and Tuliolol's new Dawn servants sharing their father's responsibilities, what's next? Well, in the spirit of continuing Azum's legacy, we're off to explore the rest of Tural. So far we've only seen the southern half of the continent, but now it's time to head north to Shaloni alongside Erenville, who is heading that way to visit his mother. And if you haven't already figured out that Tural is 14's equivalent of the Americas, the next section is about to shove it right in your face. Shaloni is basically the Wild West. It's got a desert, cacti, a small town with a saloon featuring residents with jarring American accents, and there's even some Native American equivalents. This is as stereotypical as it gets. There's a corrupt sheriff running a bandit gang and a group of outlaws trying to topple him and keep the peace. This all ends in your typical duel, and it's honestly kind of silly. So we meet with an old acquaintance of Erenville and finally learn his original name, Eleneshbia, which doesn't really have any plot significance whatsoever, outside of his old friends and family using it. There's been a few moments up until now where he's tried to hide it, and I was expecting there to be some sort of shocking revelation about his identity, but no, he just adamantly prefers Erenville. Bit disappointing, but hey. The biggest plot point before we move on from this place is Namika, Wuklemart's nursemaid. She was robbed by the aforementioned bandits, and we end up chasing them down to get her bangle back. This leads to the duel I mentioned, then it's off to the local station to hop on a train to Erenville's home of Yassolani. The tracks are in a state of disrepair, and we've got to help the train engineers with gathering supplies for repairs, who are funnily enough the Source's version of the trolley group from the first, complete with a flashback to my least favourite part of Shadowbringers. We get the timber for the tracks and the train's ready to get going again. We'll have to wait for the next one as it's all booked up, but that's no big deal. Out of nowhere we're hit by what seems to be an earthquake, only for a giant electrical dome to appear over Yassolani, with alien looking ships coming out of it and making for Tuliolon.
What in the flying? What's happening?
We arrive back in the city to see the technologically advanced invaders slaughtering civilians and harvesting some kind of essence from their corpses. Our party, the city guards and Bakul Jar Jar fend off as many of the invaders as they can, and we make our way to the palace, spotting a mysterious woman along the way. More on her in a bit. The leader of this invasion force is, of course, Zoraljar. His ambitions are strange. By invading Tuliolor, he wants to teach the masses the folly of war so that they cry out for peace, and somehow this is supposed to unite the world? Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. He's got himself some fancy new armour and some sort of body modifications, and duels his father, who straight up kills him despite all of his newfound advantages.
Farewell, Zoraljar, my son. And forgive me.
But it's not over yet. The strange device attached to Zoraljar's head revives him, gives him some sort of new power, and he kills his father right in front of us. He leaves Wuklemart with an ultimatum: lay siege to his kingdom and strike him down, then she'll be a worthy successor to their father. He's honestly a fairly generic villain, but thankfully there's a lot more to this story. So we tend to the wounded and Krile calls on some backup for our journey into the dome.
Greetings, everyone!
Y'shtola's only here for about 3 cutscenes despite her being quite prominent in the trailer, but G'rahatir joins us for more or less the rest of the main scenario. But don't worry Y'shtola fans, your fan service is in the trust system, if you know what I mean. So long story short, the gate to the Golden City actually leads to another reflection, one of the 13 shards broken off from the source during the Sundering. Unlike the first, we don't know which one this is without an Ascian's help, and given that most of them are out of the picture, we can't find out just yet. This is where we finally start to hear more about Kryle's story. If you remember, her whole reason for coming to Tural was to find out what her grandfather Galuf found in the Golden City some 20 years ago, and thanks to Ketenram we get an Echo flashback, and we finally see and hear Galuf himself. And before someone in the comments tells me, well actually we see Galuf and Eureka, you're right, but we don't get a full look at his face, and more importantly, we don't hear his voice. Now this is the only scene he's in throughout the expansion, and it being voiced makes me wonder if we'll somehow see him again. I suppose if Gaius can be retconned in post-Stormblood, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to have Galuf turn up in Dawntrail, either in the MSQ or in the Bermuda Triangle-esque field operation zone we're getting. That could potentially open up the door to seeing the rest of his group who were based on the Dawn Warriors from Final Fantasy V, including main character Bartz's father, but this is all just speculation at this point. Alright, let's reel this one back in. During the flashback, we see a pair of Lalafels bring a baby through the gate, complete with the keys Zerolja now has, as well as a familiar earring. It turns out that Kral might not be from the source after all. All this time she's been denied answers because of the right of succession, but now she knows the truth. It was a long time coming, but here we finally are. So it's off to the dome, and after mounting some guns to a train and giving it some armour and other protection, the plan is to ram it straight into the dome. This could have been another cool little section, or perhaps the intro to the next dungeon, but again it's all in a cutscene. Honestly disappointing. So our fourth dungeon is Vanguard, a facility on the border of the dome. This place looks great, the music is catchy, and the bosses are as excellent as ever. I really like the Tron-esque biker for the first boss, and yes, you can get one of the bikes as a mount, 7.5 million gil in Solution 9, but we'll get to that in a sec. The fifth zone is Heritage Found, which is a sort of mix of the lands that were already there and whatever came along with the dome. Whichever reflection this is, it's one that was ravaged by lightning, but not rejoined to the source due to its inhabitants somehow managing to harness the immense power via a precious resource known as Electrope, an ore which can store and convert lightning-aspected ether into other elements in order to produce varying effects. This Electrope powers all of the technology in this region. The tower in the distance resembles a technologically advanced version of the Ether Tree from Final Fantasy IX, and with a similar purpose. And speaking of FF9, we quickly run into Queen Sphene, 14's equivalent of Garnet, and are blasted with a wave of nostalgia that is the original FF9 soundtrack. There's about half a dozen tracks lifted directly from that game, as well as a couple of new arrangements of the classic tunes. I'm almost disappointed that we didn't get more new renditions of some of these songs, but at the same time they were already so good that they fit in just fine. Sphene is the Queen of Reason, while Zerolja holds the title of King of Resolve, to match the theme of Gulul Jar Jar's heads and the new Dawn Servants. And this is the realm of Alexandria. Act surprised. Much like with the first, time flows differently on whatever reflection it is Alexandria came from, so while the dome only just appeared for us, it's been 30 years since Zerolja first arrived in Alexandria. Sphene initially comes across as someone who cares about her people, but is hiding some sort of secret she seemingly can't talk about while the guards are around. She claims to not like what Zerolja's doing. It makes it look like their alliance was more out of necessity than what she actually wants. Of course there's more to it than that, but we'll get to it later. Like with the previous zones, we spend our time learning about Alexandria's people. The device on Zerolja's head is used by virtually everyone here, and is called a regulator. What it does is store souls, which revive someone who is killed. It can't revive someone who has died of natural causes, but it can stop people dying via accidents and the like. Regulators can also use feral souls, those of monsters, to give their users enhanced abilities, much like we saw with Zerolja. There's also a far more sinister use for the regulators. When someone dies permanently, everyone's memories of that person are erased and stored in the cloud. We get a demonstration of this after running into Namika, whose time is almost up. After her passing, nobody in the region remembers who she was. We end up meeting with a resistance group of sorts called Oblivion, led by none other than Erenville's mother, Kakuya. She's in control of this cute little robot thing, apparently in some sort of remote location, and offers us help in getting to and taking down Zerolja. Their HQ is right under his nose on the 9th level of the Tower of Everkeep, in the residential district known as Solution 9, which, conveniently for us, Sphene lets us enter as her guests. I actually really like Solution 9, even if the district on a whole is way bigger than it needed to be. It definitely feels designed around the upcoming solo battle, but the important bits are all in one spot at least. It's this sprawling cyberpunk city with tons of neon signs and advertising, vibrant lights, and the graphics card-esque Arcadion with its giant fans, waiting for us to finish the story so we can go raiding. After a quick tour and a chat with Sphene about her not wanting us to fight Zoroaljar, which we're obviously not going to agree with, we spot a Mamulja child who leads us to Oblivion's HQ, the back room, which is, the back room at a local bar. We learn that the child is, in fact, Zoroaljar's son, who was abandoned by him and given the name Gululjar. He's got a habit of disappearing fairly often, and we end up having to track him down back outside in the ruins of the old Alexandria. This place is a whole lot more reminiscent of the city in FF9, and it's where we run into Otis, the Steiner equivalent in this story.
Not another step!
What?
Villains! I will deal with them forthwith!
Originally the captain of the Royal Knights in Alexandria, Otis was a man whose soul was transferred into this Mamulja-like robot and acts as Gululjar's protector. The reason for this transfer is him volunteering himself for a project to transfer souls, which would eventually evolve into the regulators everyone uses now. The original project was designed to preserve Queen Sphene's memories and her desire to keep her people safe, but is now used to preserve everyone else as eternal beings known as the Endless. Remember how everyone's memories are stored in the cloud? Well, that's where the Endless live for all of eternity, kept alive by other people's souls. It's downright dystopian. So after our meeting with Otis, it's back towards Everkeep, where we find out that Zoroaljar is marching towards Vanguard, on his way to invade Tural. We catch up with him and learn the truth. Sphene's plan all along was to harvest all life outside the dome in order to keep the Endless alive. She doesn't want her people to suffer the pain of loss, and with more people dying, the need for souls increases, which has driven her to these extreme measures. The dome appearing in Tural was Alexandria merging itself with another world so they can harvest its souls, and the key Zoroaljar stole allowed them to open portals to other reflections at will in order to do so. Not only that, but Sphene isn't actually a real person. The real Sphene died after a great war devastated Alexandria's home reflection and killed their royal family. Her preservation was so that she could continue to rule after death, but her desire to keep everyone happy has led her down this twisted path. Wuklemark breaks Zoroaljar's regulator and he's forced to retreat, but not before ordering his troops to slaughter everyone in Tuliolon. This is another huge missed opportunity where we could have controlled the various scions outside the dome as they fend off the invaders, but instead it's just more cutscenes.
If they start bombarding us with cannon fire, we'll have no means of fighting back.
Worry not. We have a countermeasure.
Bleeding dragon!
I won't deny how great it is to see Vritra come out of nowhere to take out the ships though. Hearing the title track for Endwalker again hits so hard, and even little Ash Dyer's here. Man, how did I get hit with nostalgia for an expansion I've only just revisited? With Tuliolol able to fend for itself, Zoroaljar's invasion fails spectacularly, and he makes the call to initiate something called Code Blood. Gululjar runs in to try and talk his father down, who captures him, commands Otis to serve his king, and flees to the top of Everkeep. We then fight our way through Solution 9, defeating Otis along the way and snapping him out of serving Zoroaljar, before he sacrifices himself to protect Sphene from a raging lightning fiend. Back in the back room, we come up with a plan to assault Everkeep. We head through Origenics, a soul preservation facility serving as our penultimate dungeon, to reach the upper floors and confront Zoroaljar. And I'm repeating myself again, but this dungeon continues the trend of excellent encounters. There's even a mini-boss against a mechanised Adamantoise, which you can totally get as a mount from the hunt currency. I love this thing. Atop Everkeep we find a massive portal to yet another reflection, and confront Zoroaljar, who has absorbed an enormous amount of souls thanks to this Code Blood thing, making him a truly powerful and dangerous being.
For the last time, we fight. For duty. For blood. For everything.
Hold nothing back. This multitude of souls I shall burn to the last mote.
This is our second trial, and I think I like this one the most. It's either that or the final one. I'm really torn on it. This one has more arena changes, as seems to be the theme of Dawntrail's trials, and we actually have to watch the other platforms surrounding ours to see where attacks are coming from, and the complexity ramps up, making it kind of difficult to visualise where the safe spots are at first. For the sake of this video I did run it in duty support, and standing with the NPCs definitely helped, but in other runs since I have been caught out a few times. Maybe this is why duty support was added. At any rate, we take Zaraja down, and they pull a last minute attempt to make him sympathetic, which honestly falls flat because we don't know enough about him or his backstory for any of what he says to actually matter. Sphene then arrives to enact her plan of harvesting souls, fleeing through the portal along with the key, and closing it behind her. It's at this moment that Kakuya's robot powers down, implying that she was controlling it from the reflection beyond the portal. Our party comes to the conclusion that Sphene fled back to her own reflection, and we just so happen to know where another way in is located, the gate to the Golden City. Conveniently for us, the earring Krile was wearing was actually a storage device containing a code to control the gate and allow us access to the portal. It's briefly mentioned when we first arrive at the back room, but nothing comes of it until now. So it's back to the Skydeep cenote to open up the way to this other reflection, which Wuk-Lamat refers to as the Unlost World, and to the home of the endless, living memory. This final zone is a vibrant paradise for the souls of the departed. It's a sort of amusement park full of attractions representing the scenery that once defined the Alexandrians' land, as explained by the caretaker Constancy. At the centre of the region is the Meso Terminal, which houses the memories of Queen Sphene. Confronting her at the terminal, we learn that she's going to delete those memories so that whatever this construct or AI that resembles Sphene is can go about devouring other worlds without the conscience of the late queen weighing her down. Upon completion of this process, this world will fuse with another, and we've got to put a stop to her before that happens. We quickly run into Kakuya, confirming that she's an Endless. She tasks us with shutting down the various other terminals dotted around living memory and erasing the Endless, so this zone turns into what is essentially a reverse Ultima Thule. Along the way we run into Namika, where Wuk-Lamat can finally say a proper goodbye before shutting down the nearby terminal and erasing her for good. This hits so hard. This whole zone has us doing the equivalent of taking a loved one off of life support, and it is absolutely crushing. This is the moment of Dawntrail, the one everyone's going to remember the expansion for. Well, maybe that and all the FF9 references. Speaking of which, the second area has us run into Otis, in Hyur form this time, or I suppose Hune as they're known in this reflection. That's another thing that's touched on very briefly but not as fleshed out as in Shadowbringers. I suppose there's not all that much to tell this time around. We actually help him set up a play, which we take part in as Knights of Alexandria and Lindblum. Unfortunately they didn't go all out and name it I Want to Be Your Canary, but that name is referenced in one of the Aether Current quests for the zone, so I'll take what I can get. Speaking of the zone in general, there's a handful of fates which use the fairy battle theme from FF9 while you fight a bunch of mascots. There's even a big boss fate that does the same, and it's a great callback. I think the choice to stick with the original FF9 music was a good one, though it's definitely missing some of the more standout tracks from that game. I'm genuinely shocked You Are Not Alone wasn't in there somewhere. At any rate, we shut down the second terminal and move on to the region with an erupting volcano in the centre. The lava's harmless, thankfully. It's here we meet Kryle's parents, Robor and Alila, and finally get to hear about them.
How you've grown, my darling daughter.
But unfortunately we don't get to hear much about Kryle herself, other than her taking on her original name, now going by Kryle Maya Baldessian. A lot of the conversation happens off screen, and while it's necessary to give them some privacy, there's very little to be gleaned from the encounter regarding their short-lived reunion. I feel bad for Kryle fans who wanted to learn more about her character, because it seems like a lot of her development was cut and moved off screen. The way Dawntrail's been handling its characters is bizarre, and this might be the worst example of it. They really did Kryle dirty with this one in my opinion. We do learn a little about these Lalafell, or Milala as they're called. Allegedly hailing from a land of eternal summer, they fled their world when a calamity of ice struck. That would mean that they either fled from the reflection which was rejoined during the 5th Umbral calamity, or that they fled the source. It's up to interpretation at this point, however G'raha does mention the South Sea Islanders, who could quite possibly be the Milala of old. I guess that's for the patch quests later down the line to answer maybe. We say our farewells to Kryle's parents, deactivate the third terminal, and it's off to the final area where Kakuya and Erenville get to spend a few final moments together before saying their goodbyes. It's clear he resents her for abandoning him, and he's been very cold towards her since we got here, but he vows to continue her journey of discovery, to go where she couldn't go and do what she couldn't do. The problem with this is that Erenville and his relationship with his mother is never really fleshed out. It's barely even brought up until way after the halfway point, and even then it's largely glossed over. We've got no real attachment to this character, nor do we know enough about either of their backstories for any of it to have a real emotional impact. This has been a huge problem throughout the story. It doesn't focus enough on the right characters. I went into Dawntrail with the expectation that we'd learn more about Kral and Erenville, but Wuk-Lamat takes up so much screen time that it feels like the writers had almost forgotten about them. After our final farewells, and with living memory looking very grey and boring now, it's back to the Meso Terminal to chase Sphene down. This leads to our final dungeon, Alexandria. This is a virtual domain generated by Sphene's memories, and is a much closer representation of the FF9 original, albeit with some of the electrope technology present. As we make our way through the city, we witness the culmination of the Storm Surge, the Great War which ravaged the world with lightning. There's some great visual design on show here, and the bosses continue to be great, with the standout being the Eliminator at the end. A lot of people were expecting it to be a dungeon boss when it was revealed, and they weren't wrong. I don't mind it all that much, to be honest, because what trials we did get were all fantastic. Speaking of which, it's time for our final boss, the Queen Eternal. This giant mechanical being was what the Sphene we were seeing was all along, and with her memories now purged, all that stands in its way is our party, who all get kicked out, leaving the Warrior of Light on their own. Before the battle, the key makes an appearance, resonating with Azum's crystal and showing the same symbol on it. I think it's safe to say we now know who this belonged to. The fight itself is great, and as I said during the Zoroark trial, I'm not sure which of these two is my favourite. I love the warped grid telegraphing AoEs, the different shaped platforms we end up on, and that wall mechanic where you have to fit through the gap as it comes towards you like that one Japanese game show. It's all really creative stuff, and I can't wait for the extreme version of this to be added. Towards the end of the fight, Wuk-Lamat breaks into the simulation and somehow rekindles Sphene's memories, causing the machine to malfunction, leading us to a quick ending phase. With the machine defeated, we say our farewells to this version of Sphene created from her memories as an Endless, as she explains how powerless she was against the inevitability that her creation was flawed and that her primary directive was ensuring her people's happiness at any cost.
Brief though it was, I treasured our time together. It pains me to think that its memory will disappear along with me.
She was essentially little more than a system designed to sustain Alexandria, with no way to differentiate between right and wrong. The lesson here, kids, is don't trust AI. Either way, she gives us one last gift before fading away, the key, and in Erenville's words, so it was that the Meso Terminal fell dark and the Endless departed for Oblivion's embrace. The credits roll as we make our way back to Tuliolol. And that, my friends, is the main scenario of Dawntrail completed, for now. I'm sure the patch quests will have us figuring out how to use the key, before the next expansion or two will have us hopping around the various reflections and visiting whole new worlds, but I don't like to speculate too much. Overall, the main scenario's got a lot of problems, but I enjoyed the story when it finally got going. It's a good story, but I just don't think it's told very well. It misuses a lot of its characters, especially the Scions, who might as well have not been there for half of the story for all of the impact they had on it. It repeats itself far too often, like when Zoroark lost to his father's shade only for Kona to show up and explain exactly what happened right after we saw it happen. And of course, the pacing is downright abysmal, but once we hit those last few zones, 14's usual emotional gut punches come out swinging, even though some of them were still pretty flawed. Dawntrail will definitely go down as one of the more divisive expansions in terms of its main scenario. There's a ton of potential in here, but unfortunately not enough is realised. Fingers crossed the patch quests take us somewhere interesting and that the next expansion doesn't drag things out as much. But of course we're not done yet. It's time for a look at what endgame content we currently have. There's not much yet, but what's there is mostly excellent. So aside from the usual access to S ranks and the new set of tomestones, Dawntrail's current endgame content consists of extreme versions of the first 2 trials, 2 dungeons, and the first raid tier. Let's start with the dungeons. First up, we've got Tender Valley, which as the name suggests is a gorge full of saber-tenders, leading into ancient ruins believed to be of Yokoi origin. It's nicely challenging and each boss is fantastic. The first boss is a big beefy saber-tender, who poses up a storm and has some pretty sneaky AoEs, where if you don't stand directly behind him, you're gonna get hit when it expands. Next up is this bomb with a chimney, which launches other bombs around the arena and into different holes corresponding to openings on the sides of the arena, which launch big AoEs at you. This one's not so interesting, but the mechanic has some potential and I hope it's brought back in the future in a more complex form. Finally, we enter the ruins, face what is essentially a reskin of a boss from the Katana Ravel, which does attacks that one of the Ronkan Guardians used, and the end boss is none other than the Great Serpent of the Greatest Serpent of Tural. These ruins are essentially the Source's version of the same ruins from Shadowbringers. It's not only a nice callback to one of that expansion's more interesting dungeons, but the boss itself has some great mechanics, including a little tile maze to escape a curse. Really fun stuff overall. Next up is a lost district of living memory that's been overrun by ghosts, the Strabra Deadwalk. And if you hate clowns, maybe don't play this one. It's a run through a haunted circus, and the bosses are some of my favourite dungeon bosses in all of FF14. The only problem is a lot of players seem to have trouble with them, so I'll give you guys a bit of advice in the vain hope that I get some of you in my expert roulettes. The first boss is relatively simple. When a head spawns above you, move away from it or you'll be unable to attack for 10 seconds. The mechanic most players struggle with here is Team Spirit, where dolls run around the arena to grab and stun players. This is combined with other mechanics throughout the fight, and I've had a lot of people getting trapped by them. They've got bigger hitboxes than you think, but there's always big enough safe spots. Just give them a wide berth and it's not a problem. Next is my least favourite boss to heal for. Have you ever been to a fun fair and been on the teacups ride? Well, that's what this boss does for one of its mechanics. You have to keep an eye on the teacup that a ghost jumps into and get to the opposite side of the arena when it stops spinning. The problem is when two ghosts do this at the same time, but there's a relatively simple solution. The ghosts will either be on opposite sides or 90 degrees apart. Just remember where they are in relation to each other and keep an eye on one as they move and adjust accordingly. Once it's gone through the tea pouring mechanic and the tank buster's gone off, the ghosts will always be on opposite sides for the teacups, so just be 90 degrees away and you'll be fine. The rest of the mechanics are relatively simple. Finally, the boss where people seem to struggle to read the 3 different messages for the attacks. Use the pads to swap between Ghost and normal form, and if the attack says Ghost Duster or Ghost Crusher, swap back to normal form, and if it says Flesh Buster, turn into a ghost. The same goes for when you've got a ghost tethered to you. Turn into one to get through the wall. It's really that simple. And as I said, there's a pair of text boxes warning you about the attack, and the name of the attack appears on the boss's cast bar. I know not everyone makes that HUD element bigger, but all it takes is a glance. I'm genuinely shocked at the amount of people I've had who can't figure this out and keep dying. It's a simple case of resolving opposites, which we've had plenty of experience with by now. I think Strabra might be my favourite dungeon so far, to be honest. I love the creepy vibe, and as I said, the bosses are excellent. I think the gameplay is moving in the right direction, and I hope this sort of design trend continues. Speaking of excellent encounters, let's talk about the raids. I adore this raid tier, and I can't wait for the other 2 sets. The Arcadion is basically a pro wrestling inspired tournament, where we go up against larger than life characters who use regulators to infuse themselves with the strength of monsters, warping their bodies into these twisted creatures we have to take down. The whole story is about us rising to the top while dealing with the sinister threat of the competitors dying because of the toll these transformations take on their bodies. But I won't go over every story beat here, as I want to save that for a future video when the rest of the raids are out, so instead we'll just go over each competitor in the light heavyweight tier. First up is Black Cat, whose main gimmick is shattering the floor of the arena via AoEs. My favourite mechanic here, and probably my favourite mechanic of all these raids so far, is where she targets one player and launches them back, causing damage to the tile they land on. You have to stand so you'll be knocked onto a platform that won't break, and the whole party has to be aware of the floor at all times. Most of the rest of the mechanics are relatively simple AoEs, but the floor breaking leads to a more dynamic arena, which really keeps you on your toes. Second is Honey Be Lovely, who a lot of people are already horny for. Never change, Final Fantasy XIV community. There's a great arena transition into a really interesting mechanic where everyone has a heart meter reminiscent of The Legend of Zelda and a lot of 8 and 16-bit era games, where each attack fills one of the hearts. You have to work together to alternate between the tower stacks and dodge AoEs, or you'll be hit with heavy damage and a 5-second stun, likely leading to your death. I imagine the Savage version of this will probably outright kill you for filling all 3 hearts. Third is Brute Bomber, the stereotypical bad guy or heel wrestler. This guy straight up uses performance enhancers in the middle of the fight, gets himself disqualified, then attacks the referee. I respect the balls the writers have to go into pro wrestling's darker side here. His attacks are some of the weaker mechanics in my opinion, and all involve explosions and fire-based AoEs. The Lariat combo is pretty interesting, where he runs from side to side throwing out big clotheslines that take up half the arena, but it's nothing we haven't seen already. I love the theme of this one though. Finally, there's Wicked Thunder, the previously missing sister of Black Cat, and she's basically sexy Ixion and I don't know how to feel about it. There's a lot of relatively simple AoEs and telegraphed half arena attacks, with some clones thrown in for good measure. I had trouble with the mechanic where she breaks 3/4 of the arena because I wasn't paying enough attention apparently, but once she does that we're on a small platform where she fires her cannon back and forth, and eventually she just constantly fires cannons across the whole platform, so healers just have to keep spamming heals to keep everyone alive. Again, it's the theming of this fight that makes it super interesting. Overall these raids are fantastic, and the presentation is kicked up a notch too. The commentator actually responds to how the party performs. For example, if everyone dodges an attack, he'll remark about it. If someone's hit, he'll react to it, and so on. Then there's the fact that each competitor has their own theme song, much like in pro wrestling. And as someone who grew up on this sort of thing, I absolutely loved it. They really went all out with this stuff, and I can't wait to see more. And that's basically it for Endgame at the moment. I'm definitely going to jump in on the Savage tier when it drops, and I still need to run the Extreme trials, but other than that there's a lot of content coming out during the patch cycle, and the base expansion has set my expectations fairly high. But we'll talk about it all when the content releases. So that's Dawntrail, and honestly I think it's pretty good, after the first half. Honestly, if I wasn't making this video I probably would have stopped playing around the level 93-94 mark. While the dungeons, trials and raids are excellent across the board, the MSQ is unbearably slow paced, and quite frankly I don't think there's any excuse for it. It really feels like they needed to trim a lot of the fat from the story. There's so many cutscenes that drag on for far too long, and some completely unnecessary diversions throughout. Some of it genuinely feels worse than the post-ARR questline before the rework. I've always been someone who hates hearing the phrase "it gets better later," because in my mind a story should start good, or at the very least have some sort of hook that gets you invested. I wasn't invested at all, and it's only at the end of the 4th zone that the expansion finally hooked me, and I feel like a bit of a hypocrite when I say the payoff for all of this slow-paced nonsense is worth it. It's what 14 has excelled at for so many years, a slow-building story that pays off in a huge way down the line. But Dawntrail is particularly egregious with its pacing issues, and they are a genuine problem that drags the rest of the experience down. I hope the writers and developers learn from the feedback fans are giving them, as I've seen a lot of vocal players out there talking about the same problems I have with Dawntrail's story. Future expansions really need to learn the lesson that sometimes less is more. The role quests are inexcusably insulting to your intelligence. At this point, players have gone through essentially 5 full RPG storylines, 6 if you include Dawntrail, and had dungeons and trials of pretty solid difficulty thrown at them. There's no reason to go back to such basic stuff that anyone playing up to this point should fully understand. The game needs to challenge us and make sure we know what we're doing, not treat us like brand new players. And it's so weird because the dungeons and trials have seriously ramped up the difficulty. What were they thinking? Glaring issues aside, I loved the second half of the MSQ, and especially the final zone, despite its flaws. The writers did what they do best and actually got me emotional a few times, though I definitely think some moments could have been handled better. The dungeon bosses are mostly great, the trials are fantastic, and I even found jumping on hunt trains to be more exciting than ever. It's this sort of content that keeps me coming back, and the raids were the icing on the cake. I cannot stress how much I loved them, and I can't wait for the rest of the series to come out. Dawntrail's got a lot of potential in its patch cycle. I'm really looking forward to checking out the 14 equivalent of the Bermuda Triangle in the new field operation zone, and by the time you're watching this I'll probably be playing through Final Fantasy XI's story so I know what's going on with the upcoming Echoes of Vana'diel Alliance raids. And then there's whatever Cosmic Exploration is, there's the upcoming Beastmaster job, and the new variant dungeons, which I was a big fan of in Endwalker, despite there not being much reason to keep playing them. Regarding the future of the main scenario, I've got a few theories as to where we'll be going, and it's got me genuinely excited. I hope they lean more into the gameplay improvements, which Yoshi P has said will be the focus of the next expansion, and I pray for some Pokemon style battles with Beastmaster. Overall, I think Dawntrail is a good expansion. The first half I'd consider some of the weakest content, but the second half was great. I can definitely see this becoming another Stormblood, where the MSQ is divisive, but the encounter design is top notch. If I had to give it a rating, I'd probably put it at the bottom of the list of all the expansions so far, if only because of how frustratingly slow paced the first half was. If they cut things down a bit, I could see myself putting it somewhere in the middle. As I said, there's a lot of positive steps, but too many issues to make it truly great. Thank you for watching. I'm so glad I stuck with Dawntrail, and I have all of you to thank for that. If not for the overwhelming positivity from my previous videos and the great discussions going on in the comments, which I'm absolutely reading all of even if I don't respond to them all, I don't think I would have stuck with it past the first half, let alone made this video. I'm sorry this one took so long to make. Unfortunately, a big part of that was me wanting to do literally anything but play the story because of how much of a slog that first half was. I knew this wasn't as in-depth as my previous videos and I glossed over a lot, but I'll do a deeper dive into the story when the patch cycle wraps it up and we know where we're off to for the next expansion. I just wanted to cover the important parts for this video, and yet somehow it's dragged on for way too long again. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and comment to let me know your thoughts on Dawntrail. Join us on Discord if you want to keep up to date with what's going on and see how I get on with Final Fantasy XI as well. I've also got a Twitter that I should be way more active on than I am, and then there's Twitch where you can catch me live playing Final Fantasy XIV, XI, and whatever else takes my fancy. On the subject of FF11, I'm aiming to put out some videos on that next. I'll be doing a first impressions video after a couple of weeks with it, then some videos on its story and an overall review. And for the 14 crowd, a shorter rundown on what you need to know about 11's story, hopefully in time for the Alliance raids. I have another pair of projects in mind that involve FF14's other raids, but that's going on the back burner while I focus on 11. Thank you again for all of your support, and I hope you stick around for my future content. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and until next time, take care everybody.